Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me. I really am appreciating your campus. It's very beautiful, and I hope you don't mind me speaking in English. I took Spanish for 3 years, but it's been 30 years ago, so I'm probably better speaking in English. But your university is beautiful, and the campus is just gorgeous. This is my first visit to Colombia, and I'm very excited to be here in Bogota. So I am going to be talking about coping with rapid change, economic integration, globalization, and tying that in with the wealth of nations. Adam Smith, as we know, in 1776 wrote The Wealth of Nations. He was very curious back then as to what caused certain nations to be wealthy and others to be poor. So I'm going to try to keep this a little short because I know that lunchtime is coming up and you might be getting hungry, so I'll try to tighten it up just a little bit. So what is an economic system? How many of you have taken an economics course? Raise your hand, a few of you. So I'm going to give you a little brief introduction to economics. The definition of an economic system: a social system through which people cooperate in creating and using resources to satisfy one another's wants. The question is, and a lot of economists spend a lot of time trying to figure this out and trying to understand this, why do some systems accomplish more than others? And this is something that I am very curious about, and I plan on spending a lot of time researching. So this is where I'm from. Anybody ever been to Alaska? No. Anybody want to go there? Yes. Anybody want to meet Sarah Palin? No. But I am from Fairbanks, so this is in the center of the state, and Fairbanks is a highly resource-extractive state. So we have a large oil field on the north slope, and we have gold throughout the state. We have minerals, and in the southern part we have forestry and fisheries. However, our oil industry, like in other areas around the world, I think we've kind of reached peak oil. When we first built the pipeline, which runs from the north slope, we call the northern edge of Alaska, all the way down to Valdez, 800 miles long, a pipeline built in 1970. When we first built it, 2 million barrels a day were flowing through the pipe. Now we have 600,000 barrels a day. They had an incident last winter where the pipeline broke down for a little while and the oil started freezing up. They have to heat the oil to keep it flowing through the pipeline because Alaska is very cold. And the pipeline ended up almost becoming an 800-mile long container of black lipstick. It started freezing up so fast. So we're reaching a point where the oil revenues are going to start going away. Right now we're shielded from that because of the high oil prices. 85% of Alaska's state budget does come directly from oil, and Alaska has 20% of the known reserves in the United States. So it's a pretty important state. I thought I'd throw some pictures here for those of you who plan on visiting Alaska, but this is the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. This is the center of campus. So some people say we have 3 seasons in Fairbanks. June is spring, July is summer, August is fall, and the rest is winter. So it's a pretty austere environment to live in. 41 Fahrenheit, I think, is the same as Celsius. So it gets very, very cold. The shortest day is about 2 hours and 30 minutes long, but the sun just comes up over the horizon and then just goes back down. So it's a dark, cold environment. I invite you to come and attend the university if you'd like after that. But we do have the Northern Lights. Anybody hear about the Northern Lights? They are very, very spectacular, lights that dance in the sky. And the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus is the flagship campus of the of the state. We have universities throughout the state, but UAF has 9,000 students. We have a very strong engineering program, and I teach in the economics department. Oops. Oh, and I just wanted to show you, do you know what this is? What is it called? A moose. How do you, ¿cómo se dice en español? So she was in my driveway just 3 weeks ago. I was driving to campus and saw the moose in my driveway. So this is an overview of my talk. I'm going to go through some World Bank categories of countries in their classes of high economic achievers, middle and low economic growth countries. I'm going to delve into a little bit of the history of economic growth of the world. I think you've got an overview today of Indians, and most of you are business students, so you kind of know what's going on currently. I'm going to reflect back historically. I'm going to go over the sources of economic growth, things that we know correlate with economic growth. I'm going to take a peek at foreign investment versus foreign aid and see which one seems to be more effective in encouraging growth among the nations. Looking at the Economic Freedom Index, some economists have taken great measures to come up with statistics that correlate with economic growth, and I think this is important. If we know what causes certain nations to be wealthy and others to be poor, then maybe we can alleviate worldwide poverty in our lifetime. I think it's egregious that anybody in our lifetime should be poor. We're going to look at the historical record a little bit more, and then we're going to briefly touch on integration and globalization. What does that have to do with it? So who is rich and who is poor? The World Bank classifies the countries, and they use GNP, gross national product per capita, to do that. So they classify countries as high-income countries, and you see the US, Canada, Israel, Japan, most of the Western European countries, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, etc. Some of the other countries that produce a lot of oil. Middle-income economies, most of the South American economies, Middle East, Thailand, most of the former USSR republics, and then we have countries that earn less than $1,000 per income per resident per year, and those are the low-income economies, including China. Although there are areas that are growing astoundingly, most of China is still very poor, as in India, Vietnam, Central African countries. So this is the classification by the World Bank. I'm sorry? Okay, so the historical record, GDP per capita in 2006. In the United States, it was $37,791, 742 times the 1820 level. In India, the per capita GDP was only $2,122, only 26 times the 1820 level. So in the United States, GDP growth on average was better than 3% between 1820 and 1999. So what was going on between the United States and India? Adam Smith, I'm going to be referring to him throughout the talk, in 1776 did write The Wealth of Nations. He was very curious as to what was causing nations to be wealthy and poor. And India has natural resources, human capital. A lot of people felt in that day that India would be the powerhouse of economic growth. So what was going on between the United States and India? Why did the United States achieve such astounding economic growth? How do we explain the difference in growth between the countries? So we know that economic growth requires a surplus that can be invested in productive capital. So some possible sources of surplus would include imperialism and exploitation. So we know that in the 1800s, we had the colonial countries going around and conquering other countries, Spain, England. However, and they did all sorts of really bad things. This was Adam Smith who said this, not Karl Marx. He said the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were unable to commit impunity of every sort of injustice in those remote countries. However, looking back, it took a lot of resources just to manage the colonies, almost more resources than they were extracting from the colonies. So you can't say that imperialism is the primary source of economic growth among developed countries. And as far as exploitation, there were countries that were never colonized. Many of the poorest countries, this is a picture of Ethiopia, were never subjected to conquest, and they're one of the poorest countries. Many of the richest never colonized. This is a picture of Switzerland. So what was going on between 1950 and 1973? World economic growth was going at 4.9%. So this was a period of great economic growth. Per capita world growth during that time was 2.9%. So, what are some known sources of economic growth? Economists study this all the time. You have to have rule of law. You have to have well-established rules of the game, or else an economy is not going to flourish. When the rules of the game are changing all the time, then an economy can't grow. And in the United States is really suffering right now because the rules of the game are changing constantly. We have the president and Congress aiming fiscal policy at the economy, which is fiscal stimulus, government spending, using the government budget to try to stimulate the economy. On the other side, we have the central bank using monetary policy, expanding the money supply. So the United States money supply for years was just growing at a linear rate like this. So it's easy to plan for the future when you can kind of expect a certain level of inflation over time. But what's gone on since 2008 is it's gone like this, a $2 trillion injection of money into the economy. With all the uncertainty right now, a lot of people are just sitting on their hands, not willing to make entrepreneurial decisions or investments because they don't know what the economy is going to do, and we have serious inflationary fears. So you have to have rule of law, you have to have enforcement of contracts, property rights, all of those things that we know correlate with economic growth. When you think your property is going to be confiscated, that's not going to incentivize you to start a business. So clear, enforceable property rights. You have to have low-cost systems of exchange. So in Africa, they don't have as many navigable rivers as they do in Europe. A lot of the rivers are just there seasonally. So when exchange becomes costly, you're not going to have as much trade. And if any of you have taken an economics course, you know that trade and exchange create wealth. Trade and exchange create wealth because when we trade, we are trading for something that we want more. And remember, when economists talk about wealth, we're talking about whatever we value. So I value this more than I value that, so I'm going to give that up so I can have this. And I'm very curious about the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement that's coming on the scene. Just looking at it briefly, it seems like it might be able to help both of the economies very well. You have to be able to specialize. So Adam Smith noticed that when people specialize and then trade and exchange with other people, they become better off. That's not only in a family level, but not only in a city level, but a state level, and it also applies to international trade. So countries should specialize and do what they do really well. In Colombia, you have oil, you have coffee. What else do you have? Flowers. Coal. So you do a lot of things really well. And so that, with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, Colombia specializes in what their means of production that they can produce very well. Other countries specialize in what they do well. What does France do well? Wine, cheese. So countries should specialize, and when they specialize and then trade and exchange with each other, they can become better off. Anybody ever hear about the production possibilities curve? We can bump out of our original production possibilities curve through specialization, trade, and exchange. There are a lot of gains from trade that can be happen between countries. So economists get really excited about specialization and trade and exchange. We call that the law of comparative advantage. All of you have a comparative advantage in doing something. Each one of you individually, you're specializing, and then you're going to be trading, exchanging in society, and you're going to be making society better off. You have to have stocks of physical and human capital. You're at this wonderful university now gaining human capital, and this is portable. You can take it with you wherever you go. I've been to Thailand. Inside of Thailand, there are refugee camps because the Burmese government is not the best friendly government on the planet. Very highly resource extractive country, and they've been systematically annihilating their people, and a lot of them are internally displaced, and a lot of them have been pushed out into refugee camps inside of Thailand. But I've gone over there several times. One time I snuck in wearing camouflage up into Shan State so I could work with some orphanages there. But these students, they were sitting around holding one book, reading the book, engineering students and such, because they knew if they attributed to their human capital, they could take that human capital with them wherever they could go, even if the government was going to chase them to a different village. Technical innovation is extremely important to economic growth. And I was just in Moscow, Russia 3 weeks ago, and I was speaking at an MBA school there, Skolkovo, and what they're trying to do is adopt best practices for the university. And I spoke to a Chinese MBA director, and he said that one of the things that China does not do very well is innovate. They don't think outside of the box. One of the things that the United States tends to do very well is innovation. So the United States, we should do what we do well, right? Maybe producing movies, innovate, and those things, and trade and exchange. But technical innovation is created by people interacting in the course of trying to promote projects that interest them. Here's the beautiful thing. Individuals and countries are best positioned to know what they should produce given their resources and their human capital. When we produce things that are interesting to us individually, then we can make other people better off as well. It's the beauty of the marketplace. So poor countries have an advantage because it took the developed countries a lot of years to figure some of these institutions, and when I say institutions, I mean the rules of the game. Poor countries can immediately jump from ox carts and dirt roads to diesel trucks and concrete highways. Can anybody tell me one of the most important technical innovations in 1940 that allowed a lot of economic growth? What was that? Railroad. That happened before 1940. Yeah, so the combustion engine. Before the combustion engine, we weren't able to transport goods as much, and with the introduction of the combustion engine, large independently mobile machinery, and airplanes and jets and all of those things. So that was an example of technical innovation. But poor countries can benefit from things that took us many years to learn. So they can grow a lot faster. It might not take them as long to grow. So one of the ways countries can get the surplus to grow economically is through direct foreign investment. And just reading through the free trade agreement that the Colombian government has written, it seems like the country is trying to attract a lot of direct foreign investment. So what about private investment versus foreign aid? So we can have private investors come in and give money to countries, or we can have governments give money to countries. We've given billions and trillions of dollars to Africa. Have we seen astounding growth in many of the African countries? Well, let's take a look at foreign investment versus foreign aid. So there are issues in using private investment to encourage economic growth. You have the risk of nationalization, which is involving changing the rules of the game. So just a few weeks ago, the president of Argentina, she's nationalized at least 51% of the oil company, working on nationalizing the rest of it. Who else in South America is notorious for nationalizing businesses? Venezuela. President Hugo Chavez, right? So you're not going to be able to attract a lot of direct foreign investment into your country if the investors fear that their property is going to be confiscated by the government. So that will discourage economic growth. So also, a lot of times, private investment may benefit only the political leaders. So for a foreigner to come in and try to invest in a country, they might have to be chummy with the political leader, become friends with them, get special favors from them in order to invest there. A lot of the returns end up going to only the political leaders. So a lot of these nations that do have foreign investment are poor because the wealth is only going to the political leaders. Issues in foreign aid. So the U.S. government, many governments around the world have given a lot of money in foreign aid. So I read a book by Jeffrey Sachs, Ending Global Poverty. I stopped reading it when I found out his thesis was that every country should just give 2 to 3% of their GDP to foreign aid. I just see a lot of problems with foreign aid. What is the quid pro quo? What does that mean in Latin? This for that. So, exactly. So if I'm a country and I'm giving money to an African country, I kind of expect something in return. You might have to change your policy. So in this case, aren't we intervening in the international political sphere? How will the aid be allocated? It's hard to allocate aid within our own economy. How will we know that the aid we're giving to another country is going to be allocated the way we want it to be allocated? many times, and this is the really bad thing about foreign aid, is ends up in the hands of what we call the kleptocracies. So they steal it, and then they put it in Swiss banks and things like that. So it may end up just propping up really bad government. So many times, foreign aid does more harm than good. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In David Dollar's book, When Foreign Aid Works and When It Doesn't, he says if the goal is to lift people out of poverty, then aid should be channeled to countries with good economic policies and lots of poor people. So good economic policies would be not a lot of corruption, property rights, and those things that we know correlate with economic growth. Foreign investment, there are advantages and disadvantages of foreign investment as well. However, private investors provide the expertise to utilize the capital that they lend. There's a phrase or a term in economics we use all the time called incentives. If I'm investing in a foreign country personally, I have an incentive to make sure that it is profitable, and that will stimulate economic growth. And an entrepreneur is going to more accurately measure the probability of the success of a project. I have a picture here. This is not an igloo. It is the University of Alaska Fairbanks Museum. Bill Gates, anybody know Bill Gates? Yes. President of Microsoft, right? He gave us a lot of money to build this museum. However, look at the architecture here. In Fairbanks, many of our buildings are very boxy. We have to heat them, 41 below zero. It ends up that this museum costs us more in maintaining it and running it than the gift itself. So a lot of times foreign aid ends up doing the same thing. They might take the money and build an infrastructure project like a dam, but they might not even need it, or they might take the money to buy a plane to shuttle politicians back and forth to cities in different countries. So a lot of inefficiencies associated with foreign aid. Human capital, very significant to economic growth, and education is very, very important. Literacy is a precondition for economic growth, so we gain productive knowledge and skills, and that makes individuals wealthy, and in turn makes nations wealthy. How much does human capital contribute to the growth in the wealth of nations? There have been countries that have investing a lot in education. Well, oil, what does this mean? Oil comes from our minds. Oil comes from our minds. Until we discovered a use for oil, it was just kind of laying in the ground. It wasn't useful at all. So it's until a human being saw a purpose for it, innovated, it didn't really help anybody. So oil comes from our minds. So the biggest thing that we need more innovation, we need more ideas. And so that's where human capital comes into stimulating economic growth. Anybody know about agricultural subsidies? I don't know. Does Colombia have agricultural subsidies that you know of? A few. So in the United States and in Japan and in the European Union, we subsidize most of our agricultural products. There was enough wheat stored up in bins in the United States at one point in time to feed every man, woman, child on the planet 7 loaves of bread. So how does that happen? You that have taken an economics course, you know that agricultural subsidies on the supply side, suppliers want to supply more given the higher price. On the demand side, consumers will consume less, so you end up with surplus. What do you do with a surplus? The United States typically dumps it on the third world, and the third world, they cannot compete with free stuff, right? We're giving them free stuff and they can't compete. So they've been petitioning the World Trade Organization for the developed countries just to get rid of their agricultural subsidies. They say, if you guys get rid of your agricultural subsidies, we can compete nationally and internationally. So we've been dumping the surplus on the third world, and the surplus, or these agricultural subsidies, they incentivize very un-environmentally sound practices, so they're using way more water and fertilizers and all of those things. So the agricultural subsidies are a big problem, and I think they correlate to poverty. There's a website called Kick All Agricultural Subsidies Now, and some of the countries are calling for them to be abolished entirely because they're calling them a human rights abuse. We do have an example. New Zealand got rid of all of their subsidies just like that. They just wiped them out. And now the farming sector is growing faster than it was before. So it can be done, but we have this problem in democratized societies. We have, so you know that the cotton farmers in the United States are petitioning their politicians to keep the subsidies going their way, the 20,000 cotton farmers. So they get all the benefits, $150,000 a year to 20,000 cotton farmers. And so they disperse those costs on the rationally ignorant people. So the benefits go to those well-organized, well-informed, to those who stand to gain the most, and we disperse the cost on those who have little to gain. So that's why the subsidies stay in place, because of the special interest groups. Interestingly, the United States not only is subsidizing United States cotton farmers, well, I'm going to get to that here in a moment. There's another country that we're also subsidizing. Think about that. Think about what country we're subsidizing. Because we want to keep our subsidies going. So I actually know an economist, two economists who work on this economic freedom index. And it's a very simple little model. They found 5 statistics that correlate to economic growth. So as far as regulation, I kind of helped you out here, but would you want high levels of regulation or low levels of regulation if you wanted your country to have economic growth? Low, right? So you wouldn't want the permit Raj like they have in India. I have an Indian friend, he says he has to pay bribes just to get a phone. You're not going to have outstanding economic growth when you have high levels of regulation. Pricing practices. Do you want to have price controls like they do in Venezuela? Or do you want freedom of pricing? Yeah, prices are set in the marketplace rather miraculously through supply and demand. Nobody has to plan it. In Russia, they tried the setting of the prices for wages and goods. The organization that was responsible for that was Gosplan, and it was Mikhail Gorbachev who said, we can send somebody to space, but we can't figure out how many women's pantyhose to make, because the markets do it very, very efficiently. Any of you who've taken an economics class, do you agree with that? The markets set prices very, very efficiently. We should neither see surpluses or shortages when we allow the markets to set the prices. Monetary policy. So I'm told that the Colombian Central Bank doesn't use the money supply to try to affect the economy, but in the United States, they contract and expand the money supply all the time, the entire money supply, changing the interest rates constantly. And also, I heard that your central bank does a really good job in controlling for inflation. We have very strong inflationary fears right now. So would you want stable monetary policy or inflationary monetary policy? Stable, right. Fiscal policy, we're talking about taxation here. So you have to have reasonable tax rates. So you want to have low tax rates rather than high. How about for international trade? You want to be open or closed to international trade? Open to international trade. And all of those things, those 5 data points correlate highly to economic growth. Why do we care about economic growth? It's red and it's not moving forward. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes? Oh, there we go. So this shows the economic freedom that they mapped it out here. And so the blue countries are very, very free, and then the red countries are mostly unfree. So Chile, I think, has actually topped the United States recently in economic freedom. And so Colombia is here, relatively free. I think moving even more towards being But I know people in the United States who are thinking about moving from the United States to places like Australia and Canada because they're worried about, thank you, what's going on in the United States. So why do we care about economic freedom? Well, economic freedom also correlates with all sorts of other things. Higher personal income, less unemployment, more macroeconomic stability, greater capital investment and productivity, more business startups, it encourages entrepreneurism, a better educated workforce, less poverty and inequality, better health, greater population inflows, a cleaner environment, a better quality of life, and more democracy and peace. Economically developed countries also have lower population growth rates. Oh, goodness. Okay, so The Wealth of Nations is a very big book. I read through it this past summer, but I have my students memorize this, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, 1776, which states that the economic freedom that allows people to cooperate with one another through the voluntary exchange of private property rights. And when we're talking about property rights, it's not just land or a house, it's anything I own. I own it, nobody can take it away from me, and I can trade and exchange it if I want. To buy, sell, and trade as each best sees fit under the rule of law contributes to the development of personal national wealth. It unleashes a process that allows people to seek their comparative advantage, to find ways to produce and deliver scarce goods and services at a lower cost, and to tap the entrepreneurial motive that drives the market process. So that's the Wealth of Nations in just one paragraph. So the Asian record, looking back at this historical time frame. The elements of growth. So we see the Asian tigers, a lot of them have had astounding economic growth, although Japan has had a couple of lost decades because of crony capitalism. So capitalism kind of gets a bad name because people confuse it with crony capitalism. So crony capitalism doesn't create wealth. Crony capitalism is businesses and corporations seeking special favors from the government and their politicians. That just divides the pie up in a new way. Through trade and exchange, through specialization, trade and exchange, what Adam Smith was talking about, everybody can become better off. The whole pie can get bigger. So a lot of people have this misconception, it's a fallacy, that because one country is wealthy, that they must be wealthy because they're making another country poor. That's zero-sum thinking. The positive sum thinking would be that everybody can become better off. Typically, any country that trades with the United States ends up becoming better off and developing and growing. So you have to have the rule of law, enforcement of contracts, property rights, all of those things, competent and honest government officials, an educated populace, and openness to international trade. Anybody tell me what this is a picture of? North and South Korea at nighttime. North Korea at nighttime, I see one light. South Korea. Some people say that ethnicity correlates to economic growth. Well, one type of ethnic background is just superior to another. Well, I think Koreans are pretty much all the same. They have similar resource bases. You can't say that resources are tightly correlated to economic growth because we have Hong Kong and Singapore, no natural resources, so to speak of, but they opened themselves up to international trade. They threw themselves into the arena. So that's exactly what South Korea has done as well. They've tried to get rid of the corruption, they've opened themselves up to international trade, and they've had astonishing economic growth. So South Korea, 28-fold increase from 1960 to 2006. They invested a lot in education, and especially among the women and little girls. Some countries don't put a lot of money into educating their women, and they don't grow as well. They embraced the global economy. The government policy maintained a market perspective, and they controlled inflation. Why do we care about inflation? Higher prices. What else? So in Germany, they were forced to pay war reparations after World War I. They didn't have money, so they just used hyper runaway inflation. So a pair of shoes cost 32 trillion marks during this hyper runaway inflationary period. You'd have to have a whole wheelbarrow full of money to just buy a loaf of bread. What would that do to the savings of the middle class? All of a sudden your money's gone. Everything that you work for your entire life is gone. So I don't worry about you people so much, younger people. With inflation, you have time to recoup your wealth, but it's the elderly people that are on fixed income that really suffer. Some people say that inflationary period ushered in World War II and Nazism. So controlling for inflation is really important. And they got rid of a lot of the corruption that was going on. A lot of the public officials were indicted and convicted of corruption. In India, per capita GDP in 1960 was $606 per person. As of 2006, it was only $2,122. So given the amount of human capital and natural resources, their economy should be doing a lot better. It was only 64% of South Korea's in 1960, 11% of South Korea's in 2006. There was a lot of population growth, but not that much of a difference between South Korea and India. So you can't say that the population growth explains all of India's low economic growth. But what was going on in India? So limits to their growth, although you heard from the ambassador before that they are making some changes. They've devoted a lot of resources to national defense with their war against Pakistan. They did not allow markets and prices to allocate resources. They followed the Soviet model of central planning and price controls. Government regulation eliminated the rule of law, the permit raj. Takes 20 years sometimes during this time period just to start one business. So that's not going to inspire innovation or entrepreneurship, which we know entrepreneurs are the drivers of economic growth. Outside Asia, let's look at Latin America. 1960 to 2006, Argentina saw a 46.6% change. Argentina has been the poster child of economic growth in recent times. What have they been doing recently to stall the economic growth other than nationalizing the oil company? Very unstable policies and political regimes, right? Brazil, 177.8% change. Chile, 2.17.5. So they've had 217.5. They've been embracing economic freedom and they've been seeing a lot of economic growth. Colombia, 142.2. Mexico, mostly because of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, 150% growth. Peru, 55% growth. What about Venezuela? No growth in Venezuela from 1960 to 2006. I had a conversation with some Venezuelans last night. So many natural resources. It's a beautiful country. Venezuela should be doing very, very well. And they've adopted a lot of economic policies that we know correlate to negative growth. And so I just took a peek at the Colombia growth rate, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when the free trade agreement goes into effect next month. Outside Asia, Argentina, in 1929, they had 63% of the US GDP, so they were really close to the United States. In 2006, that's dropped down to 27.3%, probably even more now. And Chile's seen a 4% annual growth in a couple decades. A lot of the Latin American countries have also adopted this dependency theory, trying to be self-sufficient, produce everything within their own borders. It sounds good. A lot of Americans do the same thing. They have programs called Buy American. I have a friend who buys everything American. She won't buy anything from any place else, and she buys American shoes. Americans don't know how to make shoes. Her shoes are very uncomfortable and ugly. So it takes a little thinking about it, but if we do buy into the law of comparative advantage, that other countries should specialize, we can make everybody better off by buying their goods and services. So this protectionist policies tend to limit economic growth. So in Latin America, a lot of the countries adopted this theory, a theory of economic development that emerged in the 1960s The theory suggests that economic relations between rich and poor countries, most notably trade, was investment relations, have the inherent effect of enriching wealthy countries and further impoverishing poor countries. That can be true if it's crony capitalism, right? But that's also that zero-sum thinking that I was telling you about before. We can become wealthier when we trade. Dependency theorists advocate delinking, removing national economies from the flow of global trade and investment wherever possible. And so you're doing the opposite of that right now by adopting the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. State dominance, high import barriers, closed economy, general demotion of the market. So protectionist policies end up stifling economic growth. Outside Asia, what's been going on in Africa? Things don't look that great there, and they have a lot of unstable military political regimes. Also, a lot of the climate is related to diseases. The rivers are not navigable, so it lowers the amount of trade that can take place. So it's not looking that great. However, our foreign aid has been probably hurting them more than helping them. So in sub-Saharan Africa, the limits to economic growth, their climate, their geography, lack of agricultural production. Well, African countries are the ones that are going to the World Trade Organization saying, if you developed countries would get rid of your subsidies, then we could develop. And probably the biggest corollary is this unstable political regimes. Summary, countries have achieved varying levels of economic growth. Extensive research has been done on the causes of the disparity. However, integration and globalization could be the impetus to achieve worldwide prosperity. So integration and globalization, we had NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's 1,000 pages long, and a lot of the provisions of the agreement offer up protectionism, especially for American countries or companies. Americans have enjoyed a lot of protectionist policies by the government over the years. Our domestic car production, the big three auto manufacturers, nobody wants to be faced with competition. It creates a lot of pressure. And so if you can convince your government to protect you, then you don't have to face that competition. So now the government's lowering the amount of protection going on. Protection helps countries maybe in the short term, but not in the long term, because it doesn't help companies and countries to develop their true comparative advantage and to become more efficient and to deliver better goods and services. GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the problem with this is, I know one country for sure is guilty of not going along with the agreement. So I mentioned before that we're subsidizing cotton farmers. The United States is subsidizing cotton farmers. Those cotton farmers happen to be in Brazil. The Brazilian government approached the World Trade Organization and reminded them that in the agreement, the United States had agreed to drop their cotton subsidies. The United States said, well, you know, we really kind of want to keep subsidizing our cotton farmers. And the cotton farmers were a powerful lobby at that time, just a few years ago. So the United States decided, well, we're just going to keep subsidizing our cotton farmers. Brazil wasn't too thrilled about that. They decided to put tariffs on over $800 million worth of goods and services that were coming into the Brazil economy. So the United States didn't like that. So they sent a delegation down to Brazil and said, would you mind if we kept our agricultural subsidies, our cotton subsidies, if we pay your farmers as well? So the United States is now subsidizing Brazilian cotton farmers for $149 million a year. So all of these subsidies and going against the trade agreements end up causing worldwide prices to go up dramatically. So I think there's problems with GATT in that they loosely follow the terms of the agreement. So I'm curious to see how your free trade agreement will play out. I read through it. You're going to be phasing out tariffs, which are protectionist policies, taxes on imports, and there are provisions to protect labor and the environment, so I thought those were very good. But I think that these agreements need to maintain some flexibility and not become rigid. The North American Free Trade Agreement is very, very rigid, very, very bureaucratized. I would probably get rid of this phrase altogether, free trade, because it's very bureaucratized, lots and lots of rules. It's not really an example of free trade. In conclusion, President Clinton, 1993 to 2001, this is what he said about globalization. And that's basically the next big challenge, is making this interdependent world of ours on balance far more positive than negative. And the extent to which we do that will depend on whether the 21st century is marred by terrorism of all kinds or whether it becomes the most peaceful and prosperous time the world has ever known. I took 3 years of Spanish in high school, but my Spanish is very bad now. That he had us memorize Spanish proverbs. He said everybody in Latin America speaks in proverbs all the time. So one that I remember is, de la mano a la boca se pierde a la sopa. Oh, and I remember another one, but I'll get back to the first one. Aunque la mona se viste en seda, mona se queda. But de la mano a la boca se pierde la sopa. I think this is an example where we're trying to get a little bit of soup to our mouths, and we might make mistakes along the way, but I think that this new free trade agreement is a positive step in the right direction to helping all of us become better off. And I think that's it. One more last parting thing here. Our world is highly connected right now. We can't get away from that, right? Can we get away from the fact that money can move around in an instant? Can we get away from the fact that information and ideas can be exchanged instantaneously through the internet? So our challenge here is we can try to not give in, or we can challenge the change that are going on, or we can embrace it. And we ought to think about the institutional fit that will help globalization and integration along the way. Okay, that truly is it.